A young black professional, ready to celebrate a major promotion, walks confidently into his company's boardroom to pitch an innovative idea. But within minutes, the mood shifts. A senior executive questions his credentials in front of the entire team, belittling him with microaggressions and outright hostility. The situation spirals quickly, and just 10 minutes later, he's escorted out of the building under false accusations. What happens next turns the corporate world upside down, sparking a ripple effect that no one saw coming. Stay tuned. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive into it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more eye-opening stories. It started as just another day at the office. Under the buzzing fluorescence of the airport terminal, Leonard Daniels stood in a sea of travelers, his ticket clutched in his hand. The space buzzed with the mundane chaos of a Thursday afternoon. Families herding restless children, business people murmuring into cell phones, and retirees wheeling bags filled with keepsakes. To anyone passing by, Leonard looked like just another man waiting for his flight. But beneath his calm exterior was a mind as sharp as the creases in his neatly pressed suit, and a heart weighed down by decades of hard-earned wisdom. Leonard had flown countless times in his life, yet every journey felt like navigating an invisible maze where the walls were made of assumptions. He'd learned to read the subtle cues, the quick glances, the extra questions, the way smiles faltered when he approached. Today, it began at the check-in counter. "Sir, may I see your ticket again?" the young clerk asked. Her voice neutral but laced with something Leonard recognized: doubt. He handed it over without hesitation. The first-class designation bold and unmistakable. The clerk scanned it, her expression tightening ever so slightly. "One moment," she said, tapping on her keyboard with a practiced efficiency that did little to mask her discomfort. Leonard watched her, silent. He didn't need to ask what she was thinking. Her pause was louder than any word she might utter. After all, his suit, though tailored, was modest. His watch was functional, not ostentatious. And, of course, there was his skin, which had, for years, been enough to make people wonder if he belonged. "I'm sorry, Mr. Daniels," she finally said, looking up with a tight smile. "It seems there's been an issue with your ticket. It appears the flight is overbooked, and we may need to reassign your seat." Leonard's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained calm. "I booked this ticket months ago. It's confirmed, and I checked in online yesterday. I'm sure there's no mistake." The clerk hesitated, glancing at her screen again as if searching for an excuse. "Unfortunately, it's a policy. I can place you on the next available flight, or I can offer a voucher." Quote. Leonard cut her off, not with words but with a raised hand. "May I speak with your supervisor?" The words were firm but polite, a tone Leonard had perfected over the years. The clerk's shoulders stiffened, and she waved over a manager. A woman whose crisp uniform and clipped walk announced her authority before she spoke. "Mr. Daniels," the manager began, her voice carrying the forced cheer of someone used to diffusing complaints. "I understand there's been some confusion, but unfortunately, our first-class cabin is full." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Full?" "My seat was confirmed." "Well, yes, but sometimes adjustments have to be made," she said, her tone shifting to something Leonard could only describe as condescending. "We prioritize based on a variety of factors." And, quote, Leonard didn't let her finish. "And I'm curious," he said slowly, "what factors might be, because I'm noticing passengers being processed without issue. Yet here I stand." The manager faltered, her professional veneer cracking for just a moment. Around them, a few travelers began to glance over. Sensing the quiet tension, Leonard didn't have to say it outright. The weight of his unspoken accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud. "Sir, we're doing everything we can to accommodate you," the manager said, her voice tight. "If you'll step aside, we'll see what can be done." Leonard smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll wait right here, thank you. I wouldn't want to cause any confusion." He stepped aside, but not far enough to be dismissed. He watched as other passengers were checked in, their tickets scanned without issue. Among them were businessmen in suits not unlike his own. though their presence seemed to warrant less scrutiny. As he stood there, Leonard thought about the years of his life spent navigating moments like this. The small indignities that had added up to a lifetime of quiet resilience. He thought about his father, who had once been told to wait outside a hardware store while the white customers were served. He thought about his mother, who had walked miles to the nearest polling station only to be turned away for reasons that shifted like sand. And now, here he was, decades later, being told that his place, paid for, confirmed, and earned, was suddenly uncertain. The manager returned after a few minutes, her expression a carefully constructed mask. "Good news, Mr. Daniels, we've found a seat for you." Leonard nodded, his face unreadable. "How fortunate," he said, taking his boarding pass. As he walked away, he felt the eyes of the crowd on him. Some curious, some indifferent, and a few, he knew, quietly sympathetic. He kept his head high, his steps measured. This was not a victory. It was a reminder of the barriers that still stood, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be confronted. Leonard reached his gate, where the plane awaited him. As he handed over his ticket, the flight attendant smiled brightly. Through her eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Daniels," she said, her voice overly sweet. Leonard nodded but said nothing. He stepped onto the plane, settling into his seat with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly who he was. The fight wasn't over. It never was. But Leonard Daniels had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something anyone could take from him. And in moments like these, that knowledge was all the armor he needed. The first-class cabin was quiet, the hum of the engines settling like a low murmur beneath the conversations of the seated passengers. Leonard Daniels placed his briefcase under the seat and leaned back, his gaze sweeping the space around him. The seats were wide, the lighting soft, and the attendants moved with the precision of well-rehearsed choreography. Yet, despite the luxurious surroundings, Leonard felt the weight of an invisible spotlight, its beam narrowing to rest solely on him. Moments later, a flight attendant approached. She was younger than the one at the gate, with a polished demeanor that didn't quite conceal her discomfort. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked, her voice carefully modulated. "A glass of water would be fine," Leonard replied evenly. She nodded, but her hesitation was unmistakable. Her eyes lingered on him for just a moment too long before she walked away. Leonard sighed inwardly. He had learned to recognize these moments. The subtle second-guessing, the almost imperceptible double-take. It was a reminder that no matter where he sat, he would always be viewed as an anomaly in certain spaces. As other passengers filtered in, Leonard noticed a man in a dark suit settling into the seat across the aisle. The man gave him a quick glance, then pulled out a tablet, his fingers tapping briskly on the screen. A few rows ahead, a woman adjusted her scarf, her eyes darting toward Leonard before she looked away. Leonard turned to the window, watching the ground crew below as they prepared the plane for takeoff. He tried to focus on the meeting awaiting him in Chicago, the presentations he had prepared, the stakes of securing the contract that could reshape his firm's trajectory. But his thoughts kept circling back to the interaction at the gate. The flight attendant returned with his water. She placed it on his tray table with a smile that felt overly practiced. "If you need anything else, just let me know." "Thank you," Leonard said, his voice measured. As she turned to leave, he noticed a flicker of relief on her face, as though she'd been bracing for confrontation. Leonard shook his head slightly, lifting the glass to his lips. Moments later, a commotion near the front of the cabin drew his attention. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair was speaking in hushed but agitated tones to another flight attendant. Leonard couldn't make out the words, but he could read the body language, the tight jaw, the stiff posture, the darting eyes. The attendant nodded and gestured toward an empty seat further back in the cabin. The man frowned, shaking his head firmly. After a brief standoff, the flight attendant relented, and the man was shown to a seat closer to the front, one row behind Leonard. Leonard didn't need to hear the words to understand what had just happened. The man had been reassigned to accommodate someone else, someone whose priorities were deemed more pressing. Leonard glanced around the cabin and noted the familiar pattern. the subtle but undeniable hierarchy of who was offered comfort and who was asked to compromise. As the plane taxied to the runway, Leonard leaned back, letting his eyes drift closed. But just as he began to relax, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Excuse me," a voice said, sharp but not overtly rude. Leonard turned to find the man from the earlier commotion leaning over the seat divider. His expression was neutral, but there was an unmistakable edge in his tone. "Yes?" Leonard replied, meeting the man's gaze. "I don't mean to bother you," the man began, "but I couldn't help but notice, well, it's not often you see someone like you in first class. Do you travel often?" The question was posed casually, but the implication was clear. Leonard felt his jaw tighten, but he forced a smile. "Often enough," he said simply. The man nodded, as if sizing him up. "What line of work are you in?" "I run my own consulting firm," Leonard replied, keeping his tone polite but firm. "Impressive," the man said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You must have worked hard to get where you are." Leonard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the man uncomfortable. "Hard work is one part of it," he said finally, "but sometimes, no matter how hard you work, people will still assume you don't belong." The man blinked, his smile faltering. He opened his mouth to reply, but the flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the safety procedures. Leonard turned away, staring out the window as the plane lifted into the sky. The conversation lingered in his mind, a familiar echo of countless interactions he'd endured over the years. It wasn't the words themselves that stung. It was the unspoken assumptions behind them. As the plane leveled off, Leonard allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the barriers he had broken, the rooms he had entered despite the unspoken rules designed to keep him out. He thought about the mentors who had guided him, the allies who had stood by him, and the countless others who had faced far greater challenges than his own. The world had changed in many ways, but in others, it had stayed painfully the same. The lines dividing who belonged and who didn't were still there, etched into the fabric of everyday life. And though Leonard had long since learned to navigate those lines with grace, he knew they wouldn't disappear until they were confronted head-on. As he settled back into his seat, Leonard made a silent vow. He would keep confronting those lines. One step, one conversation, one moment at a time. Because change, no matter how slow, always started with someone refusing to step aside. The city was a blur of lights as the car glided toward the hotel. Leonard Daniels leaned against the back seat, watching the towering skyscrapers pass by, their glass facades reflecting the glow of street lamps. His thoughts were heavy with the events of the day. First the airport, then the flight, and now this uneasy sense that the world around him was an elaborate stage where he played a role no one had asked him to audition for. The driver pulled up to the hotel. A sleek, modern building with a grand entrance. Leonard stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he adjusted his coat. The doorman offered a polite nod, but Leonard caught the quick glance. The subtle pause, as if weighing whether Leonard belonged in such a setting. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of opulence. Marble floors gleamed under chandeliers, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Leonard approached the front desk, where a young woman in a tailored uniform greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening, sir. Checking in?" "Yes. The reservation should be under Daniels," Leonard said, handing over his ID. The woman's fingers flew over the keyboard, her smile faltering slightly as she scanned the screen. She murmured. "It seems we're fully booked tonight." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Fully booked? I made this reservation weeks ago." "It's confirmed." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the screen again. "Let me check with my manager." "One moment, please." Leonard stepped aside, his patience wearing thin. He glanced around the lobby, noting the other guests being checked in without issue. A couple strolled past him, their luggage wheeled behind them as they exchanged casual banter with another clerk. A businessman received his room key with a brisk nod. His check-in completed in seconds. Minutes stretched into an awkward silence. Finally, a man in a dark suit appeared, his demeanor polished but impersonal. "Mr. Daniels," I'm the manager on duty, he said, extending a hand. We're terribly sorry for the inconvenience. It seems there's been an error with your reservation. Leonard shook his hand, his expression calm but firm. An error? Yes, the manager said, his tone carefully neutral. We'll do our best to accommodate you. But it may take some time. Perhaps you'd like to wait in the lounge? Leonard's eyes narrowed. I don't think I've seen anyone else waiting. The manager stiffened, his mask of professionalism slipping for a fraction of a second. We assure you, we're doing everything we can. Leonard folded his arms, his voice steady but pointed. Let me be clear, I've traveled extensively for years. I know what overbooking looks like. And I know what it doesn't. What I see here is selective incompetence. The manager's face flushed. That's not, quote, save it, Leonard interrupted. Fix the issue. The surrounding guests had begun to notice, their conversations softening as curious glances turned in Leonard's direction. He could feel the weight of their eyes. Some indifferent, others silently judging. A middle-aged woman whispered to her companion, her expression a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Leonard stood his ground, his mind racing with memories of similar moments. Times when his credentials, his achievements, and even his presence had been called into question. The specifics varied, but the underlying tension was always the same, the unspoken assumption that he had overstepped his place. After an agonizing pause, the manager relented. We'll prepare a room for you immediately. Mr. Daniels, I'll personally ensure everything is in order. Thank you, Leonard said, his tone clipped. As he followed the bellhop to the elevator, Leonard caught his reflection in the mirrored walls. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed the simmering frustration beneath. It wasn't about the room. It never was. It was about the constant, insidious reminders that no matter how far he climbed, someone would always try to remind him of the ground below. When he entered the suite, the city lights stretched out before him in a glittering panorama. He placed his suitcase on the floor and sank into the armchair by the window. For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion of fighting battles no one else seemed to notice. The loneliness of navigating spaces that were both luxurious and alienating. As he stared out at the city, a thought struck him. He'd spent his life pushing against barriers, proving his worth in rooms that were designed to exclude him. But what he wanted, what he deserved, was not to fight for a seat at the table. It was to live in a world where the table was set for everyone. With a sigh, Leonard opened his briefcase and pulled out his laptop. The presentation for tomorrow still needed fine-tuning, and he couldn't afford to let tonight's indignities derail him. Yet, as he worked, the undercurrent of resolve in his heart grew stronger. Tomorrow's meeting wasn't just about securing a contract. It was about staking his claim. About making it clear that he belonged not despite the world's assumptions but because he had earned every step of the journey. And maybe, just maybe, his presence in that room would be one more crack in the invisible curtain that separated him from the world he was determined to reshape. The morning began with the same precision Leonard Daniels approached every new challenge. His suit was pressed, his tie a perfect Windsor knot, and his polished leather shoes reflected the light streaming in through the hotel window. Outside, the city buzzed with energy, a stark contrast to the quiet resolve he carried as he prepared for the meeting that had brought him here. Today wasn't just about business. It was about belonging, about shattering assumptions that clung like shadows. Leonard stepped into the hotel conference room, where the meeting was set to take place. The air smelled faintly of coffee and leather-bound folders, and the space was a study in corporate elegance. Dark wood tables, sleek chairs, and a wall of windows that framed the city skyline. Around a table sat executives in tailored suits, their conversations a low murmur punctuated by polite laughter. Leonard's arrival drew their attention, the room quieting as all eyes turned toward him. Good morning, Leonard said, his voice measured but firm. He moved toward the seat at the head of the table, his assigned spot as the keynote presenter. A man near the center, older and heavy-set with a face that spoke of decades in boardrooms, cleared his throat. Ah, Mr. Daniels, he said with a tight smile, his tone polished but lacking warmth. I believe your seat is over here. He gestured to a chair at the far end of the table. A subtle yet unmistakable move. Leonard paused, his gaze steady. The message was clear. The seat of authority wasn't his to claim. Not in their eyes. Around the table, a few glances darted nervously. But no one spoke up. The quiet tension was a familiar script. One he'd encountered too many times before. "I appreciate the gesture," Leonard replied, his smile calm but unyielding. "But I believe this is my seat." He gestured toward the head of the table, his movements deliberate. Without waiting for a response, he pulled out the chair and sat down, opening his briefcase with precision. The man's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he leaned back, his silence carrying the weight of quiet disapproval. Leonard knew that silence well. It was the sound of resistance cloaked in politeness. The unspoken challenge of proving he deserved a place in this room. The meeting began, the agenda moving through introductions and updates before reaching Leonard's presentation. As he spoke, outlining his strategies and proposals, he noticed the subtle dynamics around the table. Some executives leaned in, engaged and intrigued, while others sat back with arms crossed, their skepticism evident. Leonard met each gaze with unwavering confidence, letting the strength of his ideas speak louder than any prejudice. But as the discussion turned to questions, the challenges grew sharper. "Your projections are ambitious," one man said, his tone clipped. "Do you really think these goals are achievable, given the context?" Leonard caught the hesitation, the slight pause before context, as though the man were searching for a word that wouldn't reveal the bias behind his question. Leonard tilted his head slightly, allowing the silence to stretch before responding. "Ambition is the foundation of progress," Leonard said evenly. "And as for context, I believe that success is determined by the strength of the strategy, not by assumptions about its limitations." The man's cheeks reddened slightly, but he said nothing more. Around the table, a few heads nodded in quiet approval, and Leonard felt a flicker of satisfaction. He had turned the subtle attack into a declaration of his competence, refusing to let their doubts define him. As the meeting continued, Leonard found himself navigating a gauntlet of challenges, each question or comment laced with the undercurrent of doubt that followed him into rooms like these. But he met each one with poise, his voice steady and his arguments unshakable. He was aware of the stakes. This wasn't just about closing a deal, it was about proving, once again, that he belonged in a world that often sought to exclude him. By the time the meeting adjourned, Leonard had earned a mix of reluctant respect and cautious approval. As the executives filed out, a few stopped to shake his hand, their smiles more genuine now. But others simply nodded curtly, their expressions unreadable. The older man who had tried to redirect Leonard to the far end of the table lingered for a moment, his hands in his pockets. "You made some strong points today," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Thank you," Leonard replied, meeting his gaze. "I believe in the strength of the work." The man nodded, but there was something in his eyes. Perhaps an acknowledgement, or perhaps a quiet reluctance to concede the shift in power dynamics that had occurred in that room. As Leonard left the building, the city greeted him with its usual cacophony. Car horns, footsteps, the hum of life in motion. He felt the weight of the morning begin to lift, replaced by a steady resolve. The battles he faced weren't new, but each victory, no matter how small, carried the weight of progress. He thought about the seat at the head of the table, about the subtle resistance he had overcome to claim it. It wasn't just a chair. It was a symbol, a reminder that belonging wasn't something granted by others. It was something claimed through persistence, through refusing to yield to the quiet forces that sought to keep him on the margins. Leonard stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the flow of people around him. The day wasn't over, and the challenges would continue. But he walked with the quiet assurance of a man who knew his worth. A man determined to build a world where no one would have to fight for a seat at the table. By the time Leonard Daniels returned to his hotel room that evening, the city had transformed. The sunlight that had cast sharp shadows across its towering buildings earlier was now replaced by the soft, artificial glow of streetlights and neon signs. The day's victories should have brought him a sense of accomplishment. Yet his mind was restless, a storm of questions and doubts swirling just beneath the surface. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the world below. People moved with purpose, some rushing to catch a train, others lingering in conversation, but Leonard felt a growing distance from their urgency. What had unfolded earlier wasn't just about him or the business deal. It was about the unseen lines that divided this world. Lines that shifted and blurred but never truly disappeared. The knock at the door startled him. Leonard set his glass down and opened the door to find Darnell, his longtime friend and occasional confidant. Darnell was dressed casually, a leather jacket slung over his broad shoulders. But his face carried the weight of concern. "You didn't call," Darnell said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Figured I'd check in." Leonard smiled faintly, grateful for the interruption. "I've been processing," he admitted, motioning for Darnell to sit. Darnell leaned against the arm of a chair, arms crossed. "You're thinking about the meeting," he said knowingly. "It's not just the meeting," Leonard replied, sitting across from him. "It's everything that surrounds it. The assumptions, the quiet hostility, the way they look at you like you're trespassing." Darnell nodded slowly. "Yeah, and the worst part? They think they're hiding it. Like we don't see it." Leonard exhaled sharply, his frustration escaping in the sound. "Exactly. They don't need to say the words. It's in their tone, their body language, the way they frame their questions. They think it's subtle, but it's not." Darnell leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "So, what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Leonard had spent years navigating these waters, learning when to push back and when to let things slide. But lately, the burden of choosing has grown heavier. He was tired of the endless calculus, the constant weighing of risks against rewards. "I don't know," Leonard admitted. "Sometimes I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Even when I win, it feels like the game is rigged." Darnell tilted his head, studying Leonard closely. "The game is rigged," he said matter-of-factly. "But that doesn't mean you stop playing. It means you find a way to change the rules." Leonard looked at his friend, searching for the reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. "And how do you change rules that no one admits exist?" Darnell chuckled dryly. "By forcing them to see what they're pretending isn't there. You did that today, didn't you? You sat at the head of that table, answered their questions, and made them listen. That's how it starts." Leonard nodded, but the unease remained. He thought about the older executive who had tried to redirect him, about the veiled doubts disguised as professional courtesy. He thought about the others in the room, their expressions a mix of curiosity, resistance, and, on rare occasions, genuine respect. The battles weren't new, but they were exhausting, each one a reminder of the ground he still had to cover. "What about you?" Leonard asked suddenly, shifting the focus to his friend. "How do you deal with it?" Darnell's expression darkened slightly, his gaze distant. "I keep my circle tight," he said after a moment. "I find people who see me for who I am, not what they think I represent. And when I can, I call it out, not to change their minds. They usually don't, but to make sure they know I see them." The words struck a chord in Leonard. He thought about the people who had supported him along the way, the mentors and friends who had reminded him of his worth when the world tried to strip it away. Their belief in him had been a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Darnell stood, stretching his arms. "Look, man, you're not going to fix everything overnight. But every time you take a stand, every time you show them they can't ignore you, you're making it harder for them to keep pretending. That matters." Leonard watched as his friend walked to the door, his presence a steadying force. "Thanks for coming by," Leonard said quietly. Darnell turned his hand on the doorknob. "Anytime. Just remember, you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all of us." The door closed softly behind him, and Leonard was alone again. But this time, the quiet felt less oppressive. He returned to the window, looking out at the city with new eyes. The lines were still there, invisible but tangible, etched into the fabric of everyday life. But Leonard knew he couldn't afford to let them dictate his path. If the rules were rigged, he would find a way to rewrite them. With that resolve, Leonard returned to his desk. The work wasn't done, not for him, not for anyone, but he was ready to keep fighting. The game might be rigged, but Leonard Daniels wasn't one to back down. He was in it for the long haul. determined to claim his place in a world that still struggled to see him. The conference room was cavernous, lined with sleek glass walls that overlooked the city below. The polished mahogany table gleamed under soft overhead lighting, and around it sat a collection of power brokers, all impeccably dressed, their faces carefully composed masks of indifference. Leonard Daniels stood at the head of the table, a lone figure of calm resolve amidst an atmosphere that pulsed with tension. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks. Leonard's firm was vying for a major contract that would reshape the city's infrastructure. A project promising not just profit but influence. The kind of deal that secured legacies. But as he scanned the room, Leonard could feel the weight of expectations pressing against him. Expectations that he didn't belong here. Expectations that he was an anomaly to be tested, probed, and, if possible, dismissed. To anyone else, the meeting might have seemed like just another business pitch. To Leonard, it was a battlefield. The murmurs in the room quieted as James Redford, the senior executive overseeing the project, adjusted his tie and leaned forward. His voice was smooth, polished, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of a man accustomed to power. Mr. Daniels, we've reviewed your proposal. It's impressive, no doubt, but there are concerns about scalability. About whether your firm can handle a project of this magnitude. Leonard allowed himself a small, measured smile. He had been prepared for this. Thank you, Mr. Redford, he began, his voice steady but commanding. We anticipated those concerns, which is why our team developed a phased implementation plan. It's detailed in Section 7 of the proposal. But I'd be happy to walk you through it now. He clicked the remote in his hand, and the presentation behind him shifted to a slide outlining their strategy. As Leonard spoke, his confidence grew, his words slicing through the air like a knife. Yet, even as he made his case, he couldn't ignore the subtle undercurrents in the room. It was in the way Redford's eyes flicked to his colleagues, seeking silent affirmation. It was in the way certain members of the board whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of doubt and calculation. And it was in the way Elizabeth Crane, the only other person of color in the room, avoided his gaze, her posture rigid as though willing herself to disappear. Leonard finished his explanation, letting the silence stretch for a moment before adding, our firm has delivered on projects of similar complexity in the past. In fact, our record speaks for itself. I trust you've reviewed the case studies included in the appendix? Redford's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, though it lacked any warmth. We have, but those were smaller markets, with different demographics. This project requires a broader touch. Leonard felt the words land like a carefully disguised blow. Broader touch. It was a phrase steeped in implication, a subtle reminder of the unspoken rules that govern spaces like this. Rules that said Leonard's presence here was conditional, a fragile privilege that could be revoked at any moment. Before he could respond, another voice cut in. It belonged to Walter Grayson, an older board member with the kind of deep voice that commanded attention. Mr. Daniels, forgive me for being direct, but this is an extraordinary undertaking. You're proposing a bold vision. No question, but boldness isn't always enough. How do we know you can inspire confidence across the diverse stakeholders involved in this project? There it was, the unspoken question made plain. How do we know people will trust you? A black man, to lead something of this scale? Leonard took a breath, his mind racing even as he kept his expression neutral. He had faced variations of this question countless times before, but each time it stung anew. He could hear the unspoken doubts woven into Grayson's words. Will they follow you? Will they respect you? Will they see you as one of us? I appreciate your candor, Mr. Grayson, Leonard replied, his tone measured but firm. Trust is built through performance. And if our track record isn't enough to inspire confidence, I welcome the opportunity to earn it through action. My team and I don't shy away from challenges. We thrive on them. He paused, meeting Grayson's gaze head on. And let me assure you, we understand the stakes. This isn't just about building infrastructure, it's about building trust, building communities, and building a future that reflects the values of everyone involved. That's the standard we hold ourselves to. And that's the standard you can expect from us. For a moment, the room was silent, Leonard could feel the weight of the board's scrutiny pressing against him. Each member calculating their next move. He wondered if they were moved by his words or simply weighing the political cost of dismissing him outright. Then, unexpectedly, Elizabeth Crane spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. Mr. Daniels is right. This project isn't just about technical expertise. It's about vision, and from where I stand, his firm has demonstrated both. The room shifted. It was subtle, but Leonard could feel it. A slight loosening of the tension. A ripple of acknowledgement. Redford leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, while Grayson nodded slowly, as though conceding a point he hadn't intended to make. Leonard didn't allow himself to relax. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the tide begin to turn. As the meeting adjourned, the board members filed out one by one, their parting words a mix of polite platitudes and cryptic assurances. Leonard stayed behind, packing up his materials with deliberate care. He could feel Elizabeth watching him from across the room. "You handled that well," she said finally, her tone neutral but laced with something that felt like respect. "Thank you," Leonard replied, glancing at her, "but I doubt it's over." Elizabeth gave a small, bitter laugh. "It never is." Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were both playing the same game, navigating the same unspoken rules, walking the same tightrope, but Leonard knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. As he left the building, the city greeted him with its usual chaos. Honking horns, bustling crowds, the hum of a world that moved too fast and cared too little. Yet Leonard felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. But he was ready, because in the room where it happened, Leonard Daniels had taken his stand. And he wasn't done yet. The diner was quiet, its booths half filled with weary travelers and neighborhood regulars. The smell of burnt coffee hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint clang of a spatula on the griddle. Leonard Daniels sat at the corner booth, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Across from him, Elizabeth Crane's face was taut, her eyes scanning the room as though the walls themselves might betray them. "This is where you wanted to meet?" she asked, her voice low, clipped. Leonard nodded, glancing at the laminated menu before setting it down. "It's neutral. People here mind their own business." Elizabeth snorted softly, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Neutral? That's one way to describe it." Leonard followed her gaze to the counter, where a group of older white men in trucker caps laughed over their plates of bacon and eggs. One of them glanced their way, his gaze lingering just long enough to make Leonard's shoulders tighten. He turned back to Elizabeth. "It's not the Ritz, but we'll manage," he said evenly. Elizabeth leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You really think this meeting tomorrow is going to go the way you want? You saw how Redford and Grayson were looking at you." "I saw," Leonard replied, his tone measured. "But this isn't about what they want. It's about what's right." Elizabeth sighed, sitting back in the booth. "You're more optimistic than I am." Leonard didn't respond immediately. He sipped his tea, letting the silence settle between them. Outside, a light drizzle patterned against the window, turning the streetlights into blurred halos of gold. The city seemed to exhale, its usual chaos muted by the rain. Finally, he spoke. "You know what I realized today? They don't hate us outright. Not most of them. Anyway, they fear us." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Fear?" Leonard nodded. "Not the kind of fear you think. It's quieter, more insidious. They fear losing control. They fear the idea that we might be as capable. No, more capable than they ever imagined. It challenges their entire worldview." Elizabeth tilted her head, studying him. "And you think you can change that in a boardroom?" "I think we have to try," Leonard said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a polite smile. She took their orders, pancakes for Leonard, a black coffee for Elizabeth, and disappeared as quickly as she had come. For a moment, the only sound was the rain and the murmur of conversations around them. Leonard broke the silence. "You didn't have to speak up for me back there." "I appreciate it." Elizabeth shrugged, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't for you. It was for all of us." Leonard smiled faintly. Still, it took courage. Elizabeth waved him off. Courage is overrated. What you're doing, that's courage. Standing in front of that board, knowing half of them would rather see you fail just to prove a point. Leonard met her gaze. We're all standing, Elizabeth, whether we want to or not. Before she could respond, the diner door jingled as a new group entered. Leonard's eyes flicked to them instinctively. His body tensing. 3 men, tall and broad-shouldered, scanned the room before taking a table near the counter. One of them looked directly at Leonard, his stare cold and calculating. Elizabeth noticed. Friends of yours? Doubt it, Leonard muttered, his grip tightening on his cup. He turned his attention back to her, forcing himself to relax. Let's stay focused. Elizabeth nodded, but her eyes lingered on the men for a moment longer. When she finally looked back at Leonard, her expression was sharp. Do you ever get tired? Of what? Of having to prove yourself over and over again. Of having to work twice as hard just to get half as much respect. Leonard thought about it for a moment before replying. Tired? Sure, but giving up isn't an option. Not for people like us. Elizabeth leaned forward again, her voice dropping to a whisper. You know they're going to fight you every step of the way. Right? Even if you win this contract, they'll find ways to undermine you. To make you doubt yourself. I know, Leonard said quietly, but this isn't just about me. It's about the people who come after us. If we don't push back now, they'll keep thinking they can get away with it. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. You're a better person than I am, Daniels. Leonard chuckled softly. No, I'm just stubborn. Their waitress returned with their orders, setting the plates and cup down with a practiced efficiency. As she walked away, Leonard glanced at the counter again. The men were still watching him, their voices low, their expressions unreadable. Elizabeth followed his gaze. Do you think they know you? Leonard shook his head. Doesn't matter. They know what I represent. Elizabeth frowned. And what's that? Change, Leonard said simply. And that terrifies them. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat. Leonard picked up his fork, cutting into his pancakes with deliberate calm. As he ate, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. But he also felt something else. Resolve. Because no matter how heavy the burden, he knew the fight was worth it. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And as he looked across the table at Elizabeth, he knew he wasn't alone in carrying it. The conference room was oppressively bright, the fluorescent lights humming like a swarm of invisible bees. Leonard Daniels sat at the long, polished table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Around him, the board members of Redford and Grayson shifted in their seats, some pretending to read the documents before them, others openly staring at Leonard with a mixture of disdain and veiled curiosity. It was the moment he had prepared for, the culmination of months of quiet resistance and tireless effort. But as he looked around the room, he could feel the weight of their indifference pressing against him like a tide. Mr. Daniels, one of the board members, an older man with thinning hair and an expensive suit, finally spoke. His voice was measured, almost patronizing. We've reviewed your proposal, and while it's clear you've put in a great deal of effort, we have concerns about the feasibility of implementing your recommendations. Leonard leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. Which recommendations, specifically? The man hesitated, glancing at his colleagues. Well, for one, the workforce diversification targets. While admirable in theory, they may prove difficult to achieve in practice given the current market conditions. Leonard felt a flicker of anger but kept his tone calm. The current market conditions are a result of decades of exclusionary practices. Addressing that imbalance isn't just feasible, it's necessary. Another board member, a woman with a tight bun and an air of clipped efficiency, chimed in. We understand your perspective, Mr. Daniels, but implementing these changes could disrupt the workflow and alienate some of our more established employees. Leonard's jaw tightened. With respect, alienation is a reality many of your employees already face. Those who've been ignored, overlooked, or pushed out because they didn't fit the established mold. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut. Leonard glanced at Elizabeth Crane. seated a few chairs away. She gave him a subtle nod. Her expression unreadable but her presence a steadying force. You have to understand. Another board member began, his tone dripping with condescension. Change takes time. You can't expect us to overhaul decades of policy overnight. Leonard met his gaze, unflinching. I'm not asking for overnight. I'm asking for commitment. A real commitment. Not just words on a page or a diversity statement buried on your website. A murmur rippled through the room. And Leonard could see the discomfort growing among the board members. They weren't used to being challenged so directly. Especially by someone like him. But he wasn't finished. This isn't just about me or my team. Leonard continued, his voice gaining strength. It's about the people who've been left behind. People who've worked just as hard, if not harder, but were never given the same opportunities. It's about recognizing that talent doesn't have a color or a pedigree. The older man who had spoken first leaned back in his chair. His expression stony. We appreciate your passion, Mr. Daniels, but we have to think about the broader implications for our business. Radical changes could jeopardize our relationships with long-standing clients. Radical? Leonard repeated, his voice sharp. Asking for fairness is radical? Ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table is radical? The man opened his mouth to respond. But Leonard held up a hand. His frustration boiling over. You say you're worried about alienating clients. But have you ever considered the clients you're already alienating? The ones who look at your leadership and see nothing but the same faces making the same decisions. Year after year? Another silence fell, heavier this time. Leonard could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Their resistance. But he didn't back down. He couldn't. Let me be clear, he said, his voice steady but fierce. This isn't just about what's right. It's about what's smart. Diversity isn't a liability. It's an asset. It's innovation. It's growth. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're not the visionaries you claim to be. Elizabeth shifted slightly in her seat, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. Leonard knew she wouldn't speak unless she had to. This was his fight to lead. But her silent support was a lifeline. One of the younger board members, a man who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. You make a compelling argument, Mr. Daniels, he said carefully, but convincing this board will take more than words. What evidence do you have that these changes will yield measurable results? Leonard smiled faintly, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a thick binder and placed it on the table with a deliberate thud. You'll find everything you need in here. Case studies, metrics, projections. I've done the work. Now it's your turn. The younger man hesitated, then nodded, picking up the binder and flipping through it. Leonard could see the doubt in his eyes. But also something else. Curiosity. Perhaps even respect. The older man with thinning hair shifted uncomfortably. We'll take this under advisement, he said finally, his tone clipped. Thank you for your time, Mr. Daniels. Leonard stood, buttoning his jacket. He looked around the room, letting his gaze linger on each board member. I hope you do, he said quietly, because the world is changing. Whether you like it or not. And if you're not willing to change with it, you'll be left behind. With that, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. Elizabeth rose and followed him, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. As they stepped into the hallway, Leonard exhaled deeply, the tension finally releasing from his shoulders. Elizabeth glanced at him, her expression softening. You did good there, she said. Did I? Leonard replied, his voice tinged with doubt. Elizabeth nodded. You made them uncomfortable. That's the first step. Leonard smiled faintly, but the weight of the day still hung heavy on him. He knew this wasn't the end. Far from it. The fight for justice, for equality, for basic human dignity was never a single battle. It was a lifetime of struggle. A constant push against the tides of complacency and prejudice. But as he looked at Elizabeth, at the determination in her eyes, he felt a flicker of hope. They weren't alone in this fight. And as long as they kept pushing, kept speaking, kept demanding, change would come. It had to.